In today's tutorial, I want to show you how to make a collage animation. As with any good sequence, you need to start with a really good idea. The way I came up with mine was kind of by accident this time. I was just looking around my room and noticed an old camera that I had laying around, and I've really been enjoying taking photos with my new phone. So it kind of all made sense that I wanted to do something about cameras, and more specifically, the evolution of cameras. See, the old camera is super big and the new iPhone is pretty small compared to it. So that's kind of what sparked the idea of wanting to do something fun, combining those elements that I really enjoy. The next step from ideation is storyboard. Huion have been kind enough to send over this Canvas Pro 13, which is super sick, especially in our storyboarding phase. Being able to sketch out your storyboard is super useful down the line when you need to figure out what assets you want to use and how to transition between the scenes, because you've already kind of planned that out. So you can be way more concise and precise in your asset search and even asset creation, which we'll also be doing some of. So big thank you to Huion for sending that over to me for free. It's been super useful in creating this animation, and we're even going to use it a little bit to create some super sick frame-by-frame hand-drawn animations. Finding the right assets can be super hard, but that's where the storyboarding comes in, because it makes it a little bit easier for us to get an overview and be specific in our search. I know I need a bunch of photos of cameras. I know I want some sick textures, which I am wanting to scan by myself. I also want to incorporate some handwritten elements in there because I think that could look super sick. The main things I want to keep in mind when looking for assets is quality and making sure that it makes sense. So in this case, with it being a collage animation, I want to keep it in the paper world, kind of tactile. Now that we have the storyboard and the assets in place, we can finally hop into After Effects where the real fun begins. So in After Effects, we have a 1920 by 1080 composition set up at 24 frames per second, just to keep it nice and easy. And this will just be our main sequence, which is just 20 seconds long, just so we have that space to work with, although I don't think it'll be that long. We are just going to follow the storyboard, so we're going to start with the first scene, which will be our little match cut scene. And I've already done a little bit of pre-work. I've just created a folder with a bunch of subfolders for all the different things that we might need. And we're going to start with the camera match cut folder, which has all the different photos. And I've been so nice to myself, and I've already removed the background for most of them. Some of them didn't have a background, so we're just going to drag that in, and it'll open up with all the layers. And we'll take the pre-comp that I made and all the layers, and we'll just drag it into assets, which is just a folder I've made by clicking down here. And then you can make a folder, and then if you name them numerically, they'll always be in order, so it just makes it a little bit easier. But let's open this up and double click it, and then we'll just copy all of these. So Command C, and then go back into our main sequence and paste them in there. I like to work this way. It's not really necessary because I'll probably pre-comp them again, but it just makes it a little bit easier for me in the first place. The main idea here is to get a little match cut going using the lenses of the cameras. It's just scaling and positioning, so it's pretty straightforward to begin with. I'll just hide everything but the first camera, and then we'll just scale it down, and we can always hit Option and apostrophe to bring up our grid, and maybe line up the lens right in the middle, and then we can always move it around because it doesn't matter too much where in the composition it is. I just want it to be centered around the lens itself. And then we'll open up the next lens, or the next camera, sorry, and then move it around and scale it and make sure it is right in the middle pretty much. So now we have a little cut going there right in the middle, and just repeat this process until we've done all the layers. With all of the layers lined up, I'll just click off so I don't have any layer selected, and then hit U, which will just collapse all of them. And then we can select them all by just clicking and dragging, or by hitting Command A. And then let's go forward about 3 frames, and I'm just going forward a frame at a time by hitting Command and then an arrow key. And then at 3 frames, I'm gonna hit Shift, Command, and D to split the layers at the playhead, and then hit Delete, which will just make sure that we delete everything we don't need, so we just have each layer for 3 frames. And then we can select them all, and I'm gonna use Motion Tools, which is a free plugin, and I'm gonna set the offset to 3 and the step to 1, so it just means that every layer will be offset by 3 frames. And then we'll make sure that the staircase is going up, so it starts with the first one and then offsets the next one by 3, and etc. And then I'm just gonna hit Sequence, and now we'll have this little sequence right here, which is just centered right around the middle of the camera. We of course need to create a little bit of a background, and maybe also some accompanying elements to make it a little bit more stylish. So what I'll do is I'll hide this grid, and let's make a background by hitting Command Y, and then we can change this to background, and let's pick a nice little color. I want it to be pretty light, but also kind of muted at the same time. So I'm thinking to go with a little bit of like a beige-ish color for the background. Maybe something like that would work pretty good. and place that in the background. Next thing is to create maybe some shape elements to add a little bit more flair to it. So I'm going to click on my shape tool and just click and hold, and then select the ellipse, and then change the color to maybe like a dark green color, and just make sure you have a regular fill selected. You don't want a gradient for this, at least I don't. So I'm gonna go into my colors and maybe like a nice dark green, and then hold shift while dragging to create a perfect sphere or circle, and drag that to the very bottom. Maybe we'll also make a square in a different color, or a rectangle. I think a blue could be a pretty nice color to go with this, like a muted pastel-y blue like that. Pretty good. Move that to the background. Maybe even move the circle over just a little bit. And then we can even go ahead and add a little bit of more, like maybe some article text or something as a little bit more texture. So I'm gonna open up my folder again where I have all my assets. And in this old news one, I have 2 different articles. And maybe we'll use this one right here for something. We'll take one of these pictures, we can trim them out. I'm just gonna drag it into my composition, and then of course drag it into assets. And then in here, we can double click it to open the layer settings, and we can mask out maybe this photo down here. And I'll just select my rectangle tool to make the mask, and click and drag on one of the corners, and just hold space to move it. And then we can go back into the composition, and we will have it right there. Now, if you click this little button, it will continuously rasterize, which just means that it'll keep the quality, especially with PDFs. This is a nice little extra feature, so it doesn't look as pixelated, because let's say we scale it up to 838% and then take it off, it'll be pixelated. But with PDFs, because they are such a nice big file size and contain lots of details, we can just do it just like that. Maybe put it right over here behind the camera, maybe down in the corner here. So if I hit U again, we can collapse all our different layers. And right now we have this little sequence which just shuffles through all the cameras, and we have a little bit of shape elements. But we can add a little bit of animation to them just to spice it up a little bit more. So for the circle, I just want to do a simple scale animation. So just hit an S, we'll hit keyframe the scale, and maybe move that keyframe forward just a little bit to maybe just about a second, and then set it to 0. And then we can select those keyframes, and if you have flow, you can use it. I'm just going to use 60 speed and add that, which looks a bit like this in the curve. So it's just taking in both points. If I go back and then hit F9 to ease my keyframes, and then it's essentially just clicking and dragging these 2 points towards the middle. It's just a nice little easing. That looks pretty good with most things usually. And then maybe this blue shape, add a bit of a position and a scale. So hit P and then Shift S to bring up both of them, and keyframe that, and then move back a little bit. And we will unlink the scale, so I can just do either one, and we'll just skinny it up a little bit and maybe move it out to the left like this. And we can select both of them and 60 speed both of those, so it comes in kind of like that. But I think it'll look a little bit cooler if we offset these two. So if I take the scale and move it forward a little bit, so that it first slides in as a pretty skinny one and then shows itself. Maybe move it up a little bit, tighten up the speed so it's not coming in too late. And for the article one, let's do a simple little opacity flicker. So hit T to bring up the opacity, and then keyframe it at 100, go back 2-3 keyframes, set it to something like 70, and then go back and then set it to something like 20. And here you just want to kind of go up and down in the values every frame to get kind of a flicker. If we play that back, you can see we have a nice little flicker, and just move that forward a little bit right in the middle of these two. And I'm just going to extend this last one a little bit so that when it ends on it, it doesn't just go to nothing, so we can kind of keep carrying over the scene over to the next. But before we do that, let's add a little bit of overall texture just so we have an idea of what our general feel is like. And for that, we can go back to my folder and go into texture scans, and then we can cycle through some textures that I scanned just on my own. And I think I want to use this dark background from a notebook I have, so I'm just going to place that in there, and then hit S and R to bring up the scale and rotation, and then just rotate it a little bit and get it just about even. I think that looks pretty good. And drag that right above our background, and then we can cycle through the blend modes until we get something where we can just see a little bit of the texture, but without keeping the background of it. So just like the dots and the paper feel of it. Linear burn looks pretty sweet. Next step will be to take all our layers, so the shape layers and the little image and all our photos, and we will pre-comp all of that. So hit Shift Command C, and then we'll name this sequence 1, and open that up. And then I forgot to add the little pre at the end of it, just so we know what it is, and then we can open up. It'll probably be in here, and then just drag it into our pre-comp folder. Next up, we want to add a little bit of texture to the shapes, just to make them look a little bit cooler, and also some turbulent displays. I'll start with the turbulent display, so I'll just use FX Console and add a turbulent displace effect. And we will set the amount to something like 30 and the size to something like 2, and that's just gonna make it like a nice little roughened edges without being too crazy. And then open the evolution options and then alt click random seed, and then you can just do something like a posterize 3 and then a random 1000. So that'll just cycle between a number between 0 and 1000, and the posterize time will just slow it down a little bit so it's not super hectic. So you can see it just ever so slightly animates just a little bit. And that's one thing with collage animations, you don't want it to be too fast paced most of the time. Sometimes it works really well, but generally you want to keep it like a very papery feel, and paper doesn't move very fast. Now the good thing about this is we can take this and we can just paste it onto our blue rectangle as well, so that has that same property. Now I do want to add a little bit of movement to our shapes individually than the rest of the things. So I'm gonna hit P on my sphere and then alt click the position and maybe do a posterize time 12 and then something, maybe a wiggle, and we'll do 1,10, and that should just give it just a little bit of movement, just ever so slightly wiggling in there. And then you can of course increase the first number if you want it to be a bit more hectic. So let's say if we put it to 5 instead of 10, you can see it jumps a little bit more all over the place. And then the last number, the 10, will be how many pixels it moves. So if you set that to 5 as well, it'll just shorten the range of motion just a little bit. 1,10 worked pretty well just to keep it nice and smooth. We can right click on the position expression and copy expression only, and just hit Command V on your other shape layer and that'll paste it onto that. And the same goes with the image as well. Just paste it on there and now we have some shapes moving along. I mentioned I want to add some texture to some of these layers, and that is exactly what we're going to be doing next. So I'm going to go back into my texture folder and maybe open up one of these paper textures that I scanned. Maybe this one is pretty nice. So I'll drag that in and just make sure that I drag these into my texture folders because they're both textures. And then we can add a little bit of animation to this just to give it a little bit more life. So I'm going to solo this layer, so I'm only focused on it, and I'm going to hit P and then Shift S and Shift R to bring up the scale and rotation alongside the position. And let's start by scaling it up so it covers the whole screen, and then we'll just keyframe all of these, and let's go forward about 12 frames, and then we will turn it around a little bit, scale it up maybe, and move it around just like that, and then another 12 frames, so at 1 second, and rotate it again and maybe scale it down just a little bit and move it around, and one last time, let's rotate it a little bit more, boom. And then we can select those keyframes and right click and then toggle hold keyframe. So now we have this little animation where it just goes boom, boom, boom. We of course want to continue that, so we are going to alt click the position and just add a loop out expression. So you don't have to add anything in it, it'll just keep looping it out. And you can right click the position and then copy expression only and then paste it onto the 2 other parameters. So now it'll just keep looping indefinitely. And then we can drag it onto one or above one of our shapes. So drag it on right above the first sphere and make sure you unhide it, and then we can cycle through the blend modes again until we see one that looks pretty cool. I think linear burn looks pretty cool, but as you can see it still shows in the whole background. So what you can do is hit this little track matte, and that'll just make sure that wherever it's transparent it'll just keep that. So you can always go in and add something like levels or curves and adjust the contrast of it, maybe drag it above the shape layer too. So now we have it on all of those, and that'll be it for like the first sequence. We can start animating the second scene and the transition between them. We will start by dragging in the main elements for our second scene. So go back into the folder, and in this case we want to have our little cutouts. So I'm just going to take one at a time and drag those in, and that will just make it a little bit easier down the line. And the second and the third one, sorry. And now we can open up each of these ones just to make it a little bit easier, and I'm just going to copy them into our composition and just delete that one and copy that one, copy this one and paste it in there just like that. And make sure that our folder in here is nice and structured. Just select all the ones we just dragged in and drag them into assets. Now, if you open up, let's say the mirrorless one, you can see it just looks like a bunch of papers all over the place. So we are going to sequence them, and it's pretty easy. It's like what we did in the match cutscene. Let's do 3 frames to start, and then hit Command A and then Shift Command D to split them. And then we will just select them all, and again using motion tools, we can sequence those. And we want to do it the opposite way this time because the layer we want to land on and show for the longest time is at the bottom. So we'll just flip that order and then hit sequence, and that'll flip it out. And then we can just drag and extend this. And just like that, we have a nice little folding animation. And that is pretty much it that we're gonna do for all of those. So now if you go into this composition and go forward a little bit, we can go to, let's say, right about here, and then we will have our VHS, which is the oldest, which we'll have out to the left, and then the mirrorless right in the middle, and then the iPhone out to the right. And we will just layer these accordingly so that VHS is at the bottom, and then mirrorless, and then iPhone. Move that over just a little bit. The first sequence, let's cut that right here. So we have that boom, boom, boom coming in, and we will move these up to start right as that ends. Now what we need to do in this second part is we want, of course, to create the timeline, and we need the brush transition to transition between the two scenes. And we might even want to scale these down a little bit, so scale them down ever so slightly. So now let's get a little timeline going, and for that we're going to keep it pretty simple. We're just going to use the pen tool, and then we're going to remove the fill and select a dark gray or blackish color. We're just going to do 20-20-20. I like the color a lot, and then we are just going to click and hold shift and click again, and that'll give us a little line, and then we can adjust the width of the stroke and then just center it up a little bit so we know that it is indeed centered. We can go in and create some markers. So again, hit G to bring up a pen tool, and then just at the very beginning of this, you can just click and hold shift to create a little line. That looks pretty good, and then we can just duplicate that however many times. But to make it a little bit easier, we can animate it first and then duplicate it so that we don't have to animate each one individually. Let's start with our main timeline here, and we're just going to open that up and then go to our contents and then hit the little arrow, and then we will add a trim paths. Set a keyframe at about, let's say, 3 seconds for the end. Go back to the beginning and maybe set that to 0. So now it just comes out, animates like that. Copy that, and we will paste that onto our little line, so it'll just animate the same way. And we'll add some easing to this. Again, I'm just going to use flow just to make it nice and easy on us, and then do the same with the little line, and then decrease the spacing between the keyframes to speed it up a little bit, and maybe move that up. Now we have a little line that animates up like that, and maybe even move it up even more so it starts pretty much as soon as we can, and then just we'll have a whole row of them. So we're just going to duplicate this a bunch of times, and then we will take this last one, let's move forward a little bit, this last one, and we will drag it to the end, and then we can take this one and all the ones in between and move it out just a little bit, and then the next one, and just keep deselecting each one from the bottom. And then we will use a nice little trick that After Effects luckily has built in to space them out pretty evenly. So now you can just select all of these little ones, and then we'll use this align tool over here, and we'll make sure that we are aligning the layers to the selection, and then using this one we'll distribute them all horizontally evenly, just like that. Now we should have them all come up, and then we can select all of these, hit U to bring up the keyframes, and then select the keyframes, and then again using motion tools, this time we're just going to offset it by 2, and then sequence it from the bottom and up, and then hit sequence in order to sequence those keyframes. So now I should have a whole array of them coming in one at a time, and just like that we have a nice little timeline. Hit U to close that up, and then we'll select all of these and just trim them right at the beginning. Let's zoom in, and then we will hit Command T to bring up the text tool, and we'll just put in a random number. Like in this case I'm just going to do 1986, I feel like is a good number, and change the color to black as well, or dark gray, 20-20-20. Decrease the size of that a little bit, put her or it right there. We will make a nice little position animation, so just hit P, keyframe the position, go back a little bit and drag it down, and then select all those keyframes, or both of those keyframes, and then just add some easing to it, and I'll just cut it right there. And then let's have it come in right about here, so we have this little animation, and now we can duplicate this, and let's add a transform so that we can move it again, and this time we'll just change it to something like 2001. And then using the transform, I'm just going to move it over to around the center, just like that, and duplicate that again and change it to something like 2023 and move it over. We will sequence these as well, so just select all of them and maybe do 5 this time. So just type in 5 and then hit sequence, and that'll sequence those layers, so it'll come in and then they'll come in sequentially. We are going to go into our actual main sequence, or the first sequence that we made, and we're just going to copy the position expression because I want to add that to our cutouts. So copy expression only, and then just paste it on to all 3 of those cutouts, just to give it a little bit of movement there as well. We're going to add a little bit of almost like hand-drawn animation to it. An easy way to do this is using the pen tool, and we'll just decrease the stroke to something like 3 and select a nice bright color. Again, we can do something like a greenish color that'll contrast really well with the background, and then maybe draw a little spiral here, boom, like that, and then maybe come over this way just like that. It kind of looks like this, which looks like a bit of a mess, but if we then take the trim pass animation from the timeline, copy that and paste it onto our shape layer, and then play that back, we get this nice little animation, and we want to drag it out maybe just a little bit more, and then we also want to animate the start of it. So right before it comes to an end, we're going to keyframe the start and move forward a little bit, and then set that to 100%, and that's just going to mean that it's going to animate out in full, and then it's going to close itself back up. And if you select all these keyframes, and then maybe just a slow 60 speed for this one, just to make it a little bit more nice and not so crazy. And we can add a little bit of that turbulent displace again, and we can just go back into our first sequence and copy that just to make it nice and easy on ourselves. No reason to work twice. When you've already got it set up, just copy that and paste it onto your shape, and that'll just give it a little bit of texture in there, make it feel a little bit more hand-drawn. And let's hit U to close up all the keyframes. And then I'm gonna take this and position it between the VHS and the mirrorless layers. So that means it's gonna be in front of the camera, or the first camera, and then behind the second camera. And that's just gonna give it, I think, just a little bit more life. And let's move that up a good bit. So U, and just take these keyframes and move them up pretty early on, so we don't have a super long sequence for no particular reason. Now, I think it could be pretty cool to add a little bit of a title to each of these, just to give a little bit more of context of what it is that we're looking at. So again, select your text tool and then click anywhere on the screen, and let's just name this a VHS camera, and we will select a nice little font. Let's do a Garamond font. I think that'll look pretty cool in this kind of style. This one is pretty cool, Apple Garamond, and scale it up a little bit, and then we can place that. Let's do right here and duplicate it, and we will move it maybe over this way to the bottom, just to give a little bit, just make it a little bit different, and just put a mirrorless, maybe even, I think that looks pretty cool actually, just having it, just the first words capitalized. I'll just change this to Amaran, just like that, and then duplicate that, put that over here, and then iPhone camera. And now we can add a little bit of arrows, and it'll be the same technique as with everything else. We'll hit G to bring up the pen tool, and then we will create a nice little arrow, and we will of course change the color to, let's do our regular black, just to give it, you know, just make sure we know what's what. Then we're just gonna draw a line for our arrow. Let's do that right there, click off. And then we're going to zoom in, and I'm going to click and drag, create a little arrow, and again for the opposite side, just like that. And now we can maybe move that over just a little bit, and I think that's a pretty good little arrow. And again, we can copy the expression, or sorry, the trim pass, so copy that and paste it on to the arrow layer, hit U to bring up those keyframes, and now we have something that looks kind of like that. And we of course want the arms of the arrow to come in a little bit after the base of the arrow, otherwise it looks a bit weird. So have that come in just like that. And we will make another couple arrows to link to the other things. And if we play that back, we now have arrows that are animated. I'm gonna hit U to hide all of that. And we are gonna go in to our crazy shape layer, which will be all the way down here, and copy that turbulent displace. And I'm actually gonna copy that to this timeline as well, and also to all our arrow layers, just like that. Now we're just gonna add a very slight animation to the text. Let's have all the text and whatnot come in right about here. And I'm just gonna select one of the layers and open FX Console and type in typewriter. It's a built-in effect to After Effects if you have the newest version. I don't know which version this came in, but it's there. And I'm just gonna hit enter. And the same with the two other layers. Just make sure that we can line all the keyframes up the same. And select those three layers, hit U to bring up the keyframes, select those keyframes and add a little bit of a slow 60 speed maybe. And if you play that back, we now have a little type animation. We can tighten these keyframes up just a little bit and maybe move them over here, and then sequence them just a little bit randomly. I'm just gonna scoot them up a little bit, and then just line up the arrows with that. We're gonna take the first three layers, which will be the first arrow, and we want it to come in right about here. So hit U, and then just take these keyframes and move it to start right about here. That looks pretty good. The next three layers, hit U, and we want them to come in, let's say right about here. Last but not least, our last arrow, have that, boom, come right there. The only thing I kind of want to add to this still is creating the transition between scene 1 and scene 2. I'm going to select all my layers for this one, and we will pre-comp it. So Shift Command C, and then just name this sequence 2 pre. So this is the brush that I want to use, and I'll just drag it into assets. And essentially what I want here is to scale it down a little bit, and then I want it to animate in, and I want the first half to kind of come in this half, and then the second half will then be revealed in the second sequence. Let's scale it up to, let's do 40%. Pre-comp it and move all attributes into the new composition and just name this brush animated pre, and make sure that our pre-comps are in the pre-comps folder. We can open that up, and I'm gonna hit Command K to bring up the composition settings, and we can increase the width a little bit until we can see the whole of our brush stroke. And then we can decrease the height a little bit because we don't need all that. And then I am gonna hit G to bring up my pen tool. I'll just click up there, and then I'll change the color to a nice red color. I will click, kind of follow along the path of the brush, and we're gonna use that to reveal it, and then we can increase the stroke a whole bunch until the whole thing is covered. And open up your settings, go into contents, shape, stroke, and then change the line cap to a round cap, and just give us that nice little edge. And then we can add a turbulent displace to it and increase or decrease the size to something like maybe like a 5 to roughen it up, maybe increase the amount a little bit, decrease the size a little bit, and we can even do a roughen edges also, increase the edge sharpness a whole bunch, play around with the scale. We're gonna keep it pretty small. Well, that looks pretty good. That's just gonna give us a little bit of texture in there. Now we can go back into our sequence, and let's go into the second one and copy the trim paths. So go into that, copy the trim paths and paste it onto the stroke. So if we hit U and space out these keyframes a little bit more, maybe just about close to 1 second, and we can change the easing of it just a little bit. Maybe we'll use a fast out, so it should start a little bit slower and then pick up speed a little bit. That looks pretty cool. And you can enable motion blur if you want to, and that's just going to give us a little bit more texture out here. And then we can take our brush and we can use that as a track map just by pick whipping it, and now we have this nice little brush stroke here, and you can see we get some of that nice texture right there, which looks pretty cool. If we go back into our main sequence, and then we can drag in our brush animated pre, which is actually already in there, so we don't even need to do that. And then we are gonna cut it right here where the two layers cut, and we will take the second half and we'll move it over, and then the first half will be halfway this way. Move it up a little bit because it's only 1 second long, so we want to make sure that we don't have a whole bunch, because it should end right about here. And let's move this forward a little bit because we do want to see it come to the half to kind of sell the effect. So we need it to see, we need to see it come into that, and then we need it to start right as it is coming into itself. So right there, we should probably start it. So just like that, we've got a little thing that connects both of them, and then we of course want to animate it off. So again, we'll go into our little pre-comp here and keyframe the start, and then go forward a little bit and then set that to 100 and just add some easing to that. Let's just do a sexy speed for this one. Now we have that sequencing, boom, coming in and then out. So comes in and then animates there, and I just want to move this up just a little bit further, and then I want to change the color of it because black is pretty boring. So if we go in here and let's change the color by adding a hue and saturation, and let's do colorize, and then we can increase the colorize saturation here and pick a color that looks pretty cool. Maybe a bluish color would work pretty good. I want to change the color of this because I do not like the blue with the rest of it. Maybe we'll do a nice reddish color or something that might look a little bit better. I think that looks pretty good. So in the main composition, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add another background. So hit Command Y. Let's change that to, let's do a dark green for this one. That'll be pretty cool maybe. As this comes in on the second half, we wanna split this up. And the way we're gonna do this is by double clicking the rectangle tool up here. So double click that and then remove the stroke. And then we'll add a fill and we'll just make this a red color. Let's open up the rectangle and then right click the rectangle path and then convert to a Bezier path. Now we can take this path and we will create a little bit of a cone shape. So I'm gonna drag this one up and this one as well, and maybe take both of them and drag them out a good bit, and take the whole path and move it over. And then if we hit S to bring up the scale and then unlink it, and then if we scale it down, you can see it kind of creates the split. So that's kind of the look we're going to be going for. So keyframe to scale and move that keyframe forward and then set that to 0. And playing that back with a little bit of easing, we have something that looks roughly like this. And of course, if you want a more drastic cone, we can always get that by going into our contents and then go into the rectangle path and moving these closer together and even accentuating these as well by dragging them up pretty drastically and taking these and moving them in a little bit closer, and that'll just give us more of that split look. And then we can select our green background and we will use the shape as a track matte. So now it'll come in and it'll split up, and I would just, of course, want to line up those keyframes to match pretty good. So right here, we'll have that come in and it will be boom, split up just like that. And maybe once it comes in here, we can change the color of this, maybe turn it black like that. That might be pretty cool actually. Have it come in, boom, split up, and I want to change the background color, so Shift Command Y to bring up that and then change it to a little bit of a darker color, I think a little bit more desaturated. And of course we then want to go into our comp and change that so that our little detail elements, all the shape elements, a different color that contrasts a little bit more with the background. Now that we've changed that, so select all of that and then maybe do a nice F3, 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 and the same with our text. And we of course still want to change the color of our little squiggly line, of course, that I forgot about. That is all the way down here. And maybe change that to a yellowish, orangish color. That looks pretty darn cool. And now to sell this just a little bit more, we're gonna add a little bit of a position animation to these two layers just to help sell the movement a little bit. So if you hit P on the first sequence and P on the second sequence, just set a keyframe for both of them. And then on the second layer, you want to move that forward a little bit, kind of like in between those two, and then go forward a little bit. And for this one, we're going to drag it out to the left. And if we go forward to where we can see this one, we're going to drag it out to the right. And then we're just going to line up the keyframes so that they are the exact same and add the same easing to them. Let's do a sexy speed, and then we'll just help drive that animation just a little bit more. And we can add a little bit of movement to this as well. So just hit P on both of these, and let's move that and move that a little bit to the left and line up those keyframes with the rest. We can finally start getting towards the end scene, which is going to be our title sequence. I have this Illustrator file where I've laid out the title of it, so we already have it, so I can just import it straight into After Effects, and that is exactly what I'm going to do. We will import this text. I'm just going to select it all and just move it into After Effects. I will take both of these layers and let's pre-comp it. And we're just going to name this title pre. Make sure that is in our pre-comps folder, just like that. And I'm going to open this up and I'm just going to split it at, let's do right about 5 seconds. So I'm going to split the layers right here. So just hit Shift Command D to split that up and then move this down. We can change the color of this to make sure that we don't get confused with what is what. So for this first one, I am going to create and also go into layer, new, and then create a null object. And then we're just going to drag this below and take both of these layers and pick whip it to the null. So we're going to parent that. And then I'm going to hit S to bring up the scale, and then we can scale it up. And I want this to fill up the whole screen, kind of like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag in some articles and photos, and I have all those already. And we're just going to be reusing some of the assets. We're going to take this one that we had before and open that up, just drag it in, and then of course hit the continuously rasterize, drag it below here, and we can scale it up. And if we hit the track matte, we can see it inside of our text here. And let's move that over and kind of line it up with something that looks pretty cool. Maybe like this inside of DM, and then open up the second article right here, drag that in as well. And of course, drag these into the assets folder and hit continuously rasterize, and then track matte, of course, drag it below and then scale it up so that we have this guy in the R. I think that looks pretty cool. Then I'm just gonna hide both of these layers real quick. And I'm gonna create a shape. So just hit my rectangle tool and remove the stroke from it. I want the R to be its own thing. So I'm just gonna click and bada bing like that. We can use that as a little track matte for the second one. So I'm just gonna pick whip it to that and then invert it just like that. So now we have this one just on the R and the other one over here. And then we can add a fill. So hit Command Y, and then we will change the color. Maybe we'll do something that kind of matches with both the green and also kind of the beige. Let's do maybe a little bit of a muted blue, something kind of like that. And then we can go through the blend modes, of course, track matte, and then see what can we kind of get that looks pretty cool, that gives us some nice colors in there. Something like that looks pretty cool, and maybe even split it up. We can create a mask here, mask that up, and then duplicate it and hit M, bring up the mask, and then invert it, and then Shift Command Y to change the color of it, and we can change it to maybe a red color. And now if we go back into our main sequence, we have something that looks kind of like this, and we of course want to trim it so that it doesn't start in too late. Maybe right about here we'll have it come in, so just drag that in, and just like that we'll have something that looks kind of like this. But we of course want to give it a little bit of an animation so that it's not just text that just kind of stands still. Maybe add a little bit of a position animation to this. So select the null and then hit P, keyframe that position, move it forward just a little bit, and then go back a little bit and just drag it out to the left, add some easing to that. And if you want to, you can even go to where the animation ends and then take all of these colors, or take the articles and link them to the null as well. And it's gonna mean that they're gonna follow along just like that. And you can do that with the shape layer as well, so that we keep the same kind of color schemes and everything, our solids as well. So now we have it all coming with us. We've got a little bit of this red spilling over. I actually do like having it just as a white. So maybe take this and move it just over to the left or to the right a little bit. And of course we can take these two and parent them to the null as well, and then have them come with us. And right as it comes in here, we can cut this background away. So if we hit Shift Command D, split that up so it goes back to the normal, and even the other thing as well. So now we have, boom, comes in and then switches over to that pretty swiftly. And we will add just a little bit of a scale animation to this as well. So hit S on the null, keyframe the scale, move forward a little bit, and then scale it down just a little bit, and add some easing to it, and spread these keyframes out just a little bit. And we can always hit Shift Command Y on these solids and just increase the height a whole bunch so that it is covered when we scale down, and the same with the other one. So increase that, and that'll just make sure we don't get any white spills on the edges. And we will do it with the width also, Shift Command Y, because we do have a little bit of white over here, so just increase the width. Pretty snappy, pretty cool. We have a nice little sequence going on there. Boom, boom, pretty awesome. And let's go back into this and then add a little bit of movement to this. So hit P and then alt click the position, and then add a post-rest time. Let's do a 12, and then we're just gonna do another wiggle. Let's do 1,10 again, just to keep that nice little bit of movement. So it just has the slightest bit of movement to it. So for this title, what I wanna do is add a little bit of hand-drawn animation to it. And for that, we're actually gonna be using the Canvas Pro. I'm gonna take the text from Illustrator, which is also just the text that we have in After Effects. It's just this layer, copy that from Illustrator and into Photoshop, and that'll just make it a little bit easier for us to draw. And I just have a 1920 by 1080 canvas here, and then paste it in. We will import it as a smart object and scale it down a little bit by holding Shift. Let's place that right in the middle, and then we can create a new layer. I'm just gonna select my brush tool over here and increase the size of it a little bit, maybe to like some 30 some pixels. And let's pick a nice little brush. There's a bunch of different ones here. A textured one, like that one maybe, and change the color to a red will work perfectly fine. And now we can zoom in a little bit, and we can start outlining this a little bit and just getting some nice sketched look in here, kind of tracing it around a little bit. This is definitely way easier, either doing it by hand and then scanning it in, or in this case, using a drawing tablet like I am here, and it's gonna give us a completely different look. And we'll make 4 different versions, and then we can just cycle through them, which makes it a lot easier than having to draw way more. You can even just do 2 or 3, just depends on the look you're going for. 4 in general works pretty well. Fill that in real quick, make it super easy. We just want a nice sketch look, so you don't have to be too perfect in what you are drawing. And I think it's important to mention that in this type of drawing, you don't want it to be too perfect. You don't need to color within the lines. You don't need to fully cover it in. That's part of the charm. And we'll just keep making different versions of this. Really channel your inner child. Don't worry about drawing within the lines. And just like that, we have 4 different layers with different sketched in looks. And now we're just gonna get it into After Effects. So we're gonna save this file and then drag that PSD file into After Effects. So if we go in here into my titles and drag in that Photoshop file, and that'll be okay. Okay, make sure we go into this pre-comp and copy that and paste it in here. Delete that, make sure our After Effects is nice and organized. Bada bing, bada boom. Scale this down to be the size of our letter here. Move it over just a little bit. just like that. And then you can go into your shape layer with all the letters in there, go into contents, group, and then find the S, to be that one. And you can unhide that. No need to delete it, we might need it later, who knows. And go in here, and then let's do every 6 frames or something like that. Hit Command A to select all of them, and then Shift Command D. These 2 bottom layers we can delete, and then just select these and make sure that we offset it by 6 because every single layer is 6 frames. And then sequence that, and we will end the composition right there. So hit N to mark the end, and right click, trim comp to work area. Now we have something that looks kind of like this. And if we then move forward to right here where this comes in, place that right there and move it underneath this maybe. And then we can right click on this layer, and we will go to time, enable time remapping, go to the last keyframe, go 1 frame back, keyframe that, alt click the stopwatch and add a loop out expression, just like that. And now we have this nice little animation that goes and just loops on forever and ever. And you can even go in here and maybe even take all of these and then offset them just a little bit. So just get a little bit of a thicker look, maybe even something like that. And then take this first one and just kind of stack them a little bit and move that layer over this way like that. So we get a little bit more of a funky look. And we can always add a turbulent displace to it as well. Set that to something like 8x8, or click the evolution options in here in the random seed, and then do a posterized time. Let's do a 6 and a random 1000 again, and just add a little bit of extra texture in there, make it look really nice. Hit U to bring that up and add a fill to it, and we'll maybe make it a nice green, dark green color like we've been going for. And then the rest of this text, we can make it we'll stick to our 2020, and the same with the evolution of, and go in and 2020. We go in and create a new null object, and then take all of these layers that we've just used and pick them to the null. Select the null, hit S, keyframe the scale, go back a little bit and scale it up some, and we will hit U on our first null to bring up the scale, or just hit S, and we'll line up these keyframes with those to match the movement a little bit and get some match cutting going on in here. And then playing that back, we now have something that looks kind of like that. Now all there's left is adding just a little bit of extra flair in terms of some texture. We are going to start by hitting U to hide that, and hit N to end the composition right there, and then Shift Command Y to make an adjustment layer. Add a posterized time, set that to 12, duplicate the layer, and on the layer below, remove the posterized time, add a transform effect, alt click the position, do a posterized time, let's do 12, and then add a wiggle. We'll do 222, that'll just give us a little bit of camera shake. And as you can see, there's some edges up here, so set the scale to something like 101. It's just like the basic sauce, you guys know how it goes. But for this image sequence, we'll pull a little trick out of our hat. So if we go into that, and let's pick the camera that we are on right now. So this one, this is a paid plugin, but it is super sick. It is BCC halftones. It is so awesome. There will be an affiliate link in the description if you want to use it. Essentially, it just adds halftone to anything, and I just think it looks super sick, and it'll be perfect for a stylized sequence like this. And I like to change it to RGB so we still get the colors in there. And you can play around with the scale of the halftone and all of that. You just copy that effect and paste it onto all the other images as well. Now we will hit Command Y to create a solid, and we'll name this grain and change the comp to the comp size, and change the color to 80, which is middle gray, 50% gray, and add grain to it, which is pretty nice final output, and change it to something like maybe Codec Vision 500T, and we will add a tint effect to it as well to make it monochrome, and we can pre-comp it, move all attributes into new composition, and change that to something like linear light, which will give us a very grainy image. And we can always decrease that to maybe like 70% and drag it below our posterized time, so add that posterized time to the grain as well. And we can add a little bit of extra texture on top, just a final little overlay texture to add to it. So go into my texture scans, maybe this first one is pretty sick. Let's see what that looks like. Mess around with the blending mode. I think darker color is pretty cool. I like the look of that. And we can even go in and move that below the transform so it gets a little bit of that movement as well. Go right below that, hit Shift Command Y to add an adjustment layer, and then add a luminosity color, which is just going to give you basic color adjustments. And you can go in and maybe increase the contrast a little bit and play around with the highlights, maybe increase the highlights and increase the shadows just a little bit, and the temperature, make it just maybe just a little bit warmer in the temperature, and change the tint to be a little bit more green to give it a little bit more of a film look almost, just ever so slightly colored, change it just a little bit. Anyways, that's pretty much all for this collage animation tutorial. We've got some nice matte cutting, some sick texture. We've got a little bit of that Ali Abdaal style paper fold animations, which are super fun to do. I highly recommend that. And just some nice little techniques that you can use, some hand-drawn elements as well, which is always a nice touch that if you can add some of those. But hopefully you enjoyed this video. I appreciate you for watching, and I'll see you again next week. Peace out.